All right. And then there was only one. This was the last class, suddenly. Okay. Free yourself from the iron grip. All right, so we're going to run through the finish. Which means complete what we didn't quite get to last time, which is Karen's, and then discuss Miller, and then we'll have seen all that we were going to see about immigration. So let's get to it. So we discussed humor last time, right? Humor thinks borders should be open as a matter of moral right. People around the world have the right to migrate to pretty much any country they want, as long as they are willing to sort of behave as good citizens, right? As long as they're willing to respect the rights of other people, their freedoms, their individual human rights, their property, and so on. They basically get to go wherever they can. They get to work where people will hire them. They get to live where people will rent or sell them homes, and so forth. Karen's thinks the same is true, but for a quite different reason. Whereas humor thinks that immigration restrictions violate prima facie right that we have to be free. So the prima facie right that people don't interfere with our choices to move about unless there is some compelling reason to do so. Karen's thinks that immigration barriers need to be taken down because these are the things that really keep certain objectionable kinds of inequality in place. So if people have a sort of a fundamental right to have an equal shot at a good life around the world, and basic luck as being born here or there shouldn't really affect that in a dramatic way, and it does, he says. And so Karen's then does the same thing. He says that sets up sort of a basic idea that borders should be open because it frees up people to change their fate about where they're born. And then he goes again through at least three versions of arguments where he argues that, three versions of arguments for closing borders, and he says these don't stack up against his own starting point. So this is how he attacks the Altman and Wellman type argument. Of course, Altman and Wellman wrote their piece much later than Karen's wrote it, so he can't actually address Karen's himself. But this is the same style of argument. It's the idea that self-determination includes this free association right. And so here's Karen's response. Karen thinks this actually fails because he thinks the free association right that is invoked here by Altman and Wellman, for it to work the way that Altman and Wellman want, has to be pretty much unlimited. Right? It has to be sort of at will you get to exclude people. And he thinks that's actually not true. It's not something you get to exercise at will. Your free association, your right to association is itself limited by considerations of equal treatment. So the right to self-determination can only give states to exclude people in a way that doesn't treat them as people who are not equal. And then there's no real way to do that, he says, and so then the right fails. So there's, of course, arguments or examples you can give that would fit this, right? We talked a little bit about this before, but for example, you might say, well, a school could say our free association rights mean we only allow white students. Well, you can't do that, at least not legally in the U.S. Or you might say our church won't. Church is a bad example. So just to give our club won't allow black members. Can't do that. Our neighborhood won't allow any Jews to move in, for example. You could say that, right? Our neighborhood is an association. Won't allow Jews to move in. Can't do that. There was a Supreme Court case earlier, in sort of mid to early 20th century, where a neighborhood in St. Louis tried to do the same, not with Jews, but with black people, where the homeowners made an agreement between themselves, like we won't sell our homes to any black people, and we'll put a provision in the contract that anyone who buys the house from one of us then has to promise, put in the contract, that they won't sell their house to a black person either, and we'll include the same stipulation in the contract. So you can just have free association and free contract, preserve racial segregation that way, right? So I sell my house. To who will I sell it? Well, not to you if you're black, right? So then I'll sell it to a white person. But I'll require that the white person does the same thing if they buy my house. Right? And so on and on and on. You get to just repeat sales to only white people. No black person can ever move in. So that's not lawful in the United States. That violates the Equal Protection Clause. So the idea is, here's what Karen says, right? You see, these are exercises of free association, but we recognize that free association is not limitless. Maybe you don't want to invite any Jews to your birthday party. So that's my free association. Maybe you don't want to marry a Jewish person or a black person or a Chinese person or what have you. Right? That's your freedom of association. Karen says, maybe we shouldn't have any laws against this, but it's still not the right thing to do. You should treat people equally, including in how you associate with them.
So what you're saying is countries like Karen says that they are allowed to exclude people, but not if it's unequal to treatment. Like they can't just
Right.
keep excluding them.
Right, so there's a couple of ways you can do. Right, so the analogy would then be like, since you can't do this in free association in general, like the neighborhood and school example show, even if countries as a whole have a right to free association, they can't do it in any sort of unequal way. Now, one way to do it unequally would be to just target a particular group, right? Say like the Mexicans, you don't get to come in anymore. But, of course, Karen thinks once you accept that, you have to accept that actually you can't exclude anyone, because as soon as we start accepting that countries can exclude other people, you get these barriers again to that are like feudal privilege, right? Where he thinks, well, where you're born is now going to determine how well your life goes, and you can't really do anything about it because you can't leave. Right? And so he thinks as soon as we accept this, you'll see that this massive boundaries that governments put in place, actually, even if they're not targeted, they just say anyone else around the world cannot come here. That itself already is unequal treatment, because it condemns people to stay wherever they were. And the privilege is your own people.
And feudal privilege is basically saying wherever you're born determines how your life is going to be planned.
Yeah, that's a good way of summarizing it. Yeah. And so in feudal times, that used to be in family, right?
Yeah, hierarchy, like kings,
Right.
vassals, and things like that. And then
Yeah, if you were supposedly born with blue blood, right, then you were up. And if you weren't, if you were just a normal, right, then you were down. And there was almost no way to move up from one to the other.
and then if you're born out of the country, like people that are born in the country that have the U.S. citizenship, and other people.
Yeah, so you think, so in the world right now we live in this way. You have blue blood in this world. You might think, well, things in this world go bad, I'm a minority, maybe in the world you're tremendously well off, right? Like, things go really, really well. You've got blue blood. Of course, I've got blue blood too, right? It's not, yeah. So, but the thing is, like, if you thought that in the past it was wrong to treat some people as much better because they have blue blood, right? Which they don't really have, of course. They're just human beings like the rest of us. But we can't treat them just as having much better standing, freedoms, rights, income, wealth, power, whatever, right? Just because of where they were born in terms of family. Then you can also not treat us as the same way in just of where we were born in terms of location. Right? So if we're going to treat you and I as similar to, Mexicans was the example we used, right? And I don't know, it's like a shade between blue and red, purple. Right? Even worse, right? The real red-blooded ones would be people in real developing, very poor developing countries. Haiti or something. Then we have to let those people free to move from one class to the other. All right, so here's a question. There seems to be a pretty fundamental difference between Altman and Wellman and Karen here about how they understand freedom of association. Right? Altman and Wellman think that one of the virtues one of the strengths of their argument is that it coheres well with how we intuitively think about freedom of association in general. And you think freedom of association in general is a right, like the right to self-determination or the right as a parent and so on, which is, it's a right to make decisions, including crappy ones. Right? And so that means, including crappy ones, can be crappy in the sense of not treating everyone as equal. So they would say, like, look, if you are deep down a racist and you don't want to marry a white person, a black person, whatever it is, right? Asian person, you should seek therapy or something, right? Whatever it is to try and fix whatever it is that is giving you these nasty feelings. But given that you have these nasty feelings, you have the right to act on them. Nobody can tell you, no, you have to really marry a Chinese person. You have to really marry a black person. You have to really marry a white person, whatever it is. So clubs, right, they say the same thing. Yeah, sometimes clubs exercise their right to free association in crappy ways. Augusta doesn't allow women. It's dumb. They should have a good conversation about why the hell do we have a dumb rule like that. But given that they want to be dumb, it's their right to be dumb. Right? So to figure out where you side, you have to really figure out what you think about the right to free association. Right? So in some ways, Karians thinks, no, the right to free association is not nearly that powerful. It's limited in many ways. And both sides seem to have something going for them. Right? They can point to examples that fit their view.
I think he's right that the equal treatment, that the example of the neighborhood that you gave, for example, that's wrong. I think a case could be made, though, that that's not, the country as a whole is not equivalent for that. So to take a family, for example, parents, that's not unequal treatment if they don't want to take, someone else's child and have to feed them and take care of them. Why? Well, because they're using their resources and their time and effort to take care of the children. They're providing these services for them. And so that's what differentiates the family member from the neighborhood is that, on one hand, with the neighborhood, they're just kind of living there, but they're not actually providing that person any kind of, of their resources, their time and everything. Whereas in a country, that's more like the parent example where the country as a whole, it provides some people with welfare. It provides, all these different, whether you pay taxes or not. Even if you just live here, you're protected from what the people who do pay taxes provide. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to piece the thought together. So is your point, like, you can exclude people if you positively provide goods, but you cannot exclude people if you don't? Is that the idea?
Yeah, it seems to be kind of intuitive. The family example, the neighborhood example.
And so is that supposed to be a version of the right to free association, or is that a version of the right to choose to whom you give your resources?
Well, I mean, if someone's a part of your country, they by default have the resources. This would affirm.
No. Well, hold on. Just take one step at a time. I'm just trying to get clear what your thought is.
I was about to articulate what I was. Okay. Let me try to lay it out more clear. I think Alman Wellman could say that premise 3 is fine, even if you say that there are certain times where free association doesn't include, no matter what, accepting anyone. But they would say that in this particular case of a state, a sovereign state, they do have a right to freedom of association in the sense because of the fact that those who are a member of them, of the state, it's people, citizens, they are then claiming services provided by the state.
Right. So that's why I asked whether you think it's a free association argument or a provision point, right? Like, if you think the point is about if you are the owner of resources, either as an individual or as a collective, you get to decide to whom you disperse these resources. The comeback, presumably by someone like Karen's, will be like, fine, keep your resources. Just let people come in and choose not to. You could have Mexicans come in or whoever it is. Like say, all right, free immigration if you don't want to take any welfare. Right? Pay full ride at public schools or whatever. And if they say yes, you could have your right to resources fully respected, but your right to free association, if that's a different right, wouldn't be able to hold them out. Right?
See, that only works with some services provided, but not all. For example, protection against foreign aggressors. That's something that you can't. Karen couldn't be like, "Well, they waive that too." Well, it's like, no. If you're in the country, no matter, what the country says. I mean, that has to be provided for you because it's provided for all the other citizens. So that works up to a point.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. So public goods generally are thought to be goods that are non-excludable. So if some people enjoy them, everyone, at least in a certain population, will enjoy them. Yeah, you could invoke. I guess you can invoke that. I mean, the question. It's disputed whether you can force people to not free ride on public goods. So the idea, I mean, the worry would be that if these Mexicans come in and they're only paying for their education, and they're not paying for the defense, they're free riding on the provision of the defense, right? And so then you're saying, well, we can force them to stay out so as to prevent them from free riding. Right? So some people believe that. That's itself a disputed point, but I guess you could extend it that way. It's not clear to me that the neighborhood example works that way. I mean, the neighborhood is just a person is trying to buy a house. They're not trying to get their neighbors to rake their yard or something, right?
Yeah, that's why I think that argument works for the neighborhood example, but it does. That's what I was saying. That the neighborhood.
Well, the neighborhood is not providing any services.
I know, that's why I'm saying. That's why Karen's point works with the neighborhood. That's why I have no objection to that. I do think it's the neighborhood doesn't have a right to keep people out. Because people can have whatever.
Okay, good. I'm following.
Yeah, no. So that's okay.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I'll think about it. There's a couple of assumptions here that I think someone like Karen's would object to. Well, one is that, there's a couple. One assumption is that the people of a country collectively are owners, property owners, of the resources that the country as a whole possesses. That's an assumption that since countries are coercively funded, it's not clear that that's true. Another one is whether you can forcibly keep people out to prevent them from benefiting of goods that they're perfectly willing, let's assume, to pay for. So they don't want to be free riders. You want to keep them in a position where they're free riders and then force them to stay out because you don't want them to have to be into a free riding position. So those would be assumptions. But anyway.
Well, that one wouldn't really be an objection. For example, the family, just to show that same principle. If someone wanted to join a family and say, well, I want to come live in your house, I'll pay rent, I'll make sure it's not costing you anything extra. Well, I'd say, the family still has the right to say, no, I don't care if you pay rent, I want...
No, well, okay, yeah, well... The analogy would be, say there's a public beach, right? There's 10 or 20 people there who've cleaned it up, that part of the beach really nicely. I show up with my family and say, look, I'll pitch in, I'll do some cleaning. I brought my own trash bag, it's empty, I'm going to put some trash in there, keep it real clean. I say, no, you can't come because we're trying to keep it clean. I'll keep it clean too. He says, no, you cannot participate in it because we're doing the cleaning here.
I see where this is going. The problem with that argument, though, is you prefaced it with this is a public beach. If it was someone's private beach...
Right, but again, that's a different argument.
But you just said it's a public beach, which means it's owned by, the...
No, so that's the point, right?
State, and the other person that you in this example are also a member of that state.
Yeah, so that's now you're switching, because now you're going for a full-on property ownership argument. We'll get to that. You might think that the people in the state actually own the territory. That wasn't the point we were considering. We were considering the people are owning the resources that the state disperses, like welfare, education, and so on. So that's the activities that we're doing on the beach, right? So we're assuming that the beach itself is not owned yet. Now, if we assume the beach is owned, it's a different story. But now you have to ask, do you, and well, I'm not a citizen, but most people here together own the United States territory? Karen thinks the answer is no, you don't. Individual people own individual plots, but you don't together own the whole country. And if the people individually own the plots, they could invite Mexican people over, right? And you wouldn't have anything. So you have to assume it's a public beach for the analogy to hold. All right, Jason?
I would say one of the issues I've always found with freeloader argument
Yeah.
is it seems to assume that when these resources are put out, they just stop with the person who received them. They get welfare and that money's gone now. Like it just has disappeared from the economy. And then it all cycles right back into the economy. For instance, food stamps might have a higher economic return when they're actually used versus someone going in and using cash. I don't remember the exact numbers for it. I just remember reading about it in Forbes and a handful of other things. But it's not so much like someone's coming in and like give me all these resources and I'm not going to do anything. It's give me the means by which I can actively contribute as a member of society. Because if you have no transportation, you have no means of living, if you don't have the basic essentials that you need to survive outside of work, there's not much you can do forward. You get kind of stuck in this perpetual loop of poverty and things like that. So it's not really like people are coming in just to take resources, consume them, and that's the end of it. Those resources are coming back through. And more often, I mean, there are people that will take them, but they're by far the minority of people that collect these resources. Generally, these resources come out to be investments where it takes a longer term, like a longer view to see how it pays off. In the short term, it may seem like you're spending, but in the long term, again.
Yeah, maybe. I don't want to get too far afield here. I'm skeptical usually of those arguments because by the same reason that you say, like, it's not that these resources evaporate, they get put back in the economy. So too, it's true that what made these resources available in the first place is that they were taken out of the economy elsewhere, right? So now you have to compare is where we're taking them away from by taxing people worth more or less than what you get back out of it, and then see if it's a good deal or not. My personal take would be like, I don't think the right argument, like let's say that it breaks even or you just a little worse of a deal. That wasn't the point. The point of giving people welfare wasn't that it was a good public investment. But anyway, the point was that they needed or something. But anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent. The free riding argument itself is usually the idea is used in a slightly different context. The idea being that certain benefits need a lot of people to contribute to be produced in the first place. And the logic of these goods is that because you can't exclude anyone from enjoying them, they create like a prisoner's dilemma type situation that we discussed weeks ago, where it's true for every individual person that their own individual contribution won't decide whether the good gets produced or not. And if the good gets produced, they will enjoy it anyway. So for each and every individual person, it's rational to not contribute, because if everybody here, let's say that we need 30 people to keep the beach clean, right? And there's 30 some people here, let's say. So I'm thinking to myself, should I do my bit, right? Let's assume that we don't know who does the bit. Like, of course, if you know me, I might be ashamed, or I might, whatever. Maybe you might force me. Assume you don't know. Right? Everyone says we just need everyone to pitch in at their preferred time of day. Or something. So should I go or not? Well, if everybody else shows up, there'll be more than enough people cleaning the beach. The beach will be clean, right? So I can stay home. Now, of course, if not enough of people show up, me myself, I can't clean the whole beach by myself. So if I go, I'll just work a whole day and not. I'll waste my time. So I should stay home. And so it doesn't matter what all of you do. If enough people show up, I should stay home, rationally speaking. And if not enough people show up, I should also stay home. So whatever you guys do, I should stay home. But that's true for each and every one of us, right? And so now not enough people show up and the beaches are dirty as well. Littering is the opposite, right? So like you litter a little bit. Does that make the street dirty? No, it's just one piece of gum, whatever. Of course, if everybody does it, the streets will be really filthy. And every person thinks, well, my individual piece of gum isn't going to decide whether it's gone. But if everybody does it, now you live in a dirty street. So what people worry about is that the logic of a public good, it's not excludable, is set up in a way that will make people not want to contribute and become free riders. And then they say, well, how do you solve it? You force people to contribute. So you tax them or something. I think that was the kind of argument I thought Ryan was invoking. The bus is like the free rider, of course, the same like the metro or something, right? You hop the turnstile. Does that stop the metro from running? No. Everyone hops the turnstile, yes. Now, if everybody else is hopping and you're the only one who pays, metro is not running. Right? Nobody else hops and you don't pay, metro is still running. So it doesn't really matter what everybody else does. Right? It's rational for you to hop the turnstile. And that's true for everybody, and now you have a problem. Right? So that's why there's actually physical barriers to stop, like to make it impossible to hop the turnstile, because otherwise too many people will not do it. That's the word. Anyway, that was the tangent. All right. Two other cases. So the two other things that Karen says. Here's the property argument. That's the one that Ryan just invoked. So you say, well, if you own something, you get to exclude people. Right? The government, so maybe the people united in their government, if you are happy with that, own their territories as their property, and then it follows that you can exclude immigrants from a country as if it's your property. Right? And then he has a social contract theory. You can read up on this. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Throughout, Karen's does the same thing. Right? So he denies the second premise here. He thinks, actually, you can read up on this again. I'm not going to just talk about the property one. Actually, the governments or the people united in their governments, they don't own their territories. So it's not true that the United States population, all the United States citizens together own the whole United States as a country. Maybe the government owns parts of it, right? So national parks, for example, right? Are owned by the federal government, so that the federal government owns. The property we're on here is owned probably by the state of North Carolina. Right? But does it own the entire United States? Well, it depends, right? So I bought my house, right, from someone, and they signed over a title deed to me, right? Standardly, people think that means I own my house and the land on which it's built. Right? Not the government, me. And if the government takes it from me, say in an eminent domain, because I want to run a highway through my house, they have to expropriate me. They have to actually take the property from me and get it, and then buy it and give me fair compensation. That's the standard juridical requirement. Right? And so then the idea is, well, there's at least a part, right, my part of the United States territory that is owned not by the United States government or United States citizens as a whole. It's owned by me. And so many other places. Right? If that's true, then this second premise is false. Right? This is an empirical claim. It's a claim about what factually is the matter, who owns the land. And so if I tell an immigrant from Zimbabwe, hey, come and stay in my house, the government will say, no, you won't. Right? Not longer than whatever tourist visa you might be able to get expires. They'll move you out. But if the question is, why do they get to do so? And the answer is, well, they own my house. That seems false. They don't. I own my house. The government doesn't get to decide who stays in the guest room. I get to decide who stays in the guest room. Anyway, that's the objection here. There's some arguments from Nozick that Karen invokes to back that up. But that's the intuition. Does anyone want to, what do you think of that, by the way? This is a very popular idea still, despite what Karen said. Yeah?
So, let's say I own a house.
Yeah.
The government wants to build a highway through. If I say no, that means that they're going to allow me. At the end of that, they're going to get their way. If they do get their way, then ultimately I really don't own them, provided they like, it's only mine, assuming they don't use it.
Good. So there's two questions there. So, Michael, did you raise your hand or not? Go for it.
Especially if you own like its value, but not necessarily it, because if they do like use your property, they have to compensate you for it. So yeah.
You really put a price on mine.
Well, yeah. So that's a great question. So there's two things here, right? So what can the government and can they not do to you if they want to build something? And the other one is what does that mean for your ownership of it? So as a matter of fact, it depends. So if the government wants to buy your house from you to do whatever they want, right? A highway or a rail track or a mall or something, right? They have to make a case, right? So they can make you an offer, first of all, and then if you say no, they can start legal proceedings to use eminent domain, expropriate you. And that would mean if that goes through, then yeah. So sometimes people who don't want to sell their property, their homes, or their land, get expropriated forcibly by the government, and they receive then fair compensation, which is basically what the government deems would be a fair market value. So they assess it, they say, be 150,000, here's 150,000, get out. It's kind of controversial what the purpose is for which they can do this. They can't do it for anything. They can't do it just for the heck of it. They can't do it because you voted for the wrong woman or man, right? The traditional standard was that it had to have a public dimension. So it started way back in the, I think, early 19th century when they were trying to do large railroad projects. And the problem, of course, with large railroad projects is that in order for the railroad to work, you need to have a continuous chain of property. And so you go to the people who are on the line, right, and you start buying it. And if you own a little piece, let's say I want to build a rail line from New York City to San Francisco, right? And you live in Nebraska or something. I don't know if that's whatever. I'm drawing it through Nebraska, right? You live in Nebraska, and you know that I'm the government. I've purchased all these lands from New York all the way up to your land, and then from your land all the way up to San Francisco, right? So the viability, you own a large plot of land. Let's say you can't just quickly go around it or something. It's a mountain and a river. Or maybe you own just a big piece of land, and I would have to really restructure it for millions of dollars, the whole project to get. Can I buy your land? Right? No. So 150,000? No. And you know that it is worth my while because I've invested so much money, millions of dollars before I get. But the market price would only be 150. You can really extract a lot of value that way, right? Make it practically impossible. And so the idea would be that if you would have to go through ordinary contracts, ordinary sales, these things like large rail tracks, but also large military bases, for example, it's used for those things often, they would become nearly impossible because there's always going to be a couple of holdouts who know, like, all right, I've seen these plans, right? This is a payday. And they thought, well, that can't be held hostage that way. And so eminent domain says if you can show that there is a real public need, things that really the government ought to be doing and cannot be doing unless these sales can be made to go through, then if a fair price is paid, you can take it. Controversially, I think this was a 2007 case, Kelo, K-E-L-O. I think that's in Delaware. Anyway, there's a town, Kelo, where the local governments wanted to revitalize a neighborhood by building a mall. And there was an old lady lived in a house for a long time and said, I don't want to sell, I want to die here, I'll live all my life. And they tried eminent domain. And traditionally, the idea you'd have to be a real public thing, like a railroad, a highway, a military base, something like that. This is a mall, right? That's a private, the idea it's not a public, it's a private goal. And went all the way to Supreme Court, and they said, no, you can do it. So that woman got expropriated, and the mall's being built. So the idea was, well, the economic revitalization of the neighborhood was a public goal. That's very controversial. Lots of people think, well, in this case, you're making almost anything a public goal if you sort of, we like our town better if this mall is there, goes through. But anyway, so yes, they can. It's become, the last decade, the set of things for which they can do it has become more capacious, larger. Now, what does it mean for your ownership, right? So that's a philosophical question. Some people would say that what Michael said is the right thing to do, that is like you own the value, not really your home. That might be a little disturbing if you live in a home for a long time and you want to live there. You say, I don't care about the value, I care about the home. John Locke was one of the famous first theorists of property, sort of our conception of property. And he has a famous line where he says, if things can be taken from you without your consent, then you don't really own it at all. So that would fit with what you're saying, that maybe you're not really the owner. They're really the owner, and they let you have it for a little while, or for maybe all the time. But it's always up to the government. That's not an unproblematic idea itself, right? Because if you think that you own things only if nobody can take it from you without your consent, then taxation becomes a real tough pill to swallow. Right? Because taxation means that your income can be taken from you without your consent. And so do you own your income? Well, you better, because you're using your income to buy that house, right? And so Locke himself thought you have to actually consent to taxes. So taxes had to always get popular approval. And that's tough, or at least difficult. Anyway. Yeah,
Well,
Jason.
property taxes kind of support the notion that the government owns all of the territory as its property also, because you're essentially paying rent to a landlord that is your government. If you're not up to date on your rent, they'll just take it from you and kick you out. Which that's not ownership, that's borrowing or renting or leasing or whatever.
Yeah, well, if it's true that you can only tax people on something if you're the owner, it's right. It might be that the government has powers of taxation that don't require that it owns something before they can tax it. But sure, yeah, if you believe in what Locke said is true, then you'd have to say that at least the government acts as if it's the owner. Right? Now, maybe ethically speaking, they aren't, and so they're violating your property rights by taking it from you. Right? But that would be that's not the way Cairns goes about it. Cairns thinks the government doesn't own it, and he probably wouldn't think that they're acting as if they own it by taxing everyone. But as soon as you accept that they really don't own everything, then you can't use that as a justification to keep immigrants out. Right? Because it's not yours, so you don't get to decide who enters it. This is a little hairy, though, right? Last point. One very popular idea is not that the government or the people, through the government, own the entire territory, but that's not a very popular idea. But what is a popular idea is that the people or the government own the resources in the territory. So we've seen that with Poggi, for example, right? Like Poggi's this idea that the government can just sell off the resources, the oil and so on. That's a bad idea. People think, why? Well, because it belongs to the people. It should be really theirs to decide. Or the money should at least go back to the people and not just in the pockets of the rulers, the dictators and so on. So if you think that the oil in Nigeria belongs to the Nigerian people, right? Or the oil in Alaska belongs to the Alaskan people, so that it gets taken out, right? Exxon comes to Alaska, pumps it out. They pay the Alaskan government, and the Alaskan government sends a check every year, right, to the Alaskan people. The idea being that they get paid for the sale of the resources that ultimately belongs to them. That's getting very close to thinking that this is correct, right? The government of Alaska is acting as the owner on behalf of the Alaskan people. And so if the oil that's sitting in the ground is collectively owned by the Alaskans or the Nigerians or the who have you, right, then we're at least pretty close to saying not just the oil in the ground, but the ground that contains the oil belongs to all the Alaskans or the Nigerians or the who have. Anyway. So it's not an obvious thing to be denied, even if you want to deny it. You look very confused. Do someone? Yeah? What are you confused about?
Well, I think resources. What if the resources are coming from other countries, and those people in their countries want to take claim to wealth that those are in other countries? You know what I mean? Like,
Not yet.
for example,
Keep going.
US,
Yeah.
it's the local resources, it's not like people from the US and resources from the US. Like other countries, so if you want to, the oil workers in Venezuela and maybe some workers of Bolivia. Like, there's so much that we kind of private other people. So if those workers want to reclaim a share of that wealth, I don't know.
Well,
I
we
just
paid for it. Maybe like, instead of like, let's say it was two countries, like in one country they have like raw materials and sold to another country very cheaply. This country manufactures it and makes a killing off of it. If this country will never see any of like the profits that the other countries make. If we only
to the land. So there's exploitation. So there's people who have the right, who are working, and they don't really have to, I don't know, I'm just, it doesn't matter. This is like way out.
Yeah, I think I'm following where your thoughts are going. I was trying to connect them to the idea of resource ownership. So is the worry what was the example? Like we had an example of oil in Venezuela, you said?
So if they just want to get some off of it and live here and enjoy that wealth that they have built.
So assume for a moment that what Ryan said is true, right? Let's say that these people, they took a job at a company and the company owned whatever it was that it was selling and sold it for the price. Would you think then still they would have a right to come here? They have all the steps. We know the history is dirty, right? Let's set that aside for 1 second. Imagine that the history is clean, right? So there wasn't any force and violence. It wasn't, despite what some people say, a terrible dictator in Chavez who was pillaging his own people and sending off the oil for ideological purposes and not selling them at the market price. Let's say he didn't actually do that, right? Let's say that he actually had people in Venezuela work for a decent wage and get the full value of the oil that they were selling. And the U.S. paid it. Right? All these things are not true. Right? Let's say that they were true for a second. Would you then think that they could still come here?
I think that I would agree. So yeah, they still pro it. I mean, I would understand that.
Okay, good.
That everything's fair. Yeah.
Right, good. So, okay, nice. So then the idea is that seems to be that, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that there is some sort of argument from correcting the past theft as a correction of the past theft of the resources. Those people have a right to immigrate so as to set the balance straight. Is that the idea? Sort of.
It was just a question. Plus, I don't have my glasses.
Okay. Well, no, that's interesting, right? Because if that's the idea, then it seems then the first starting assumption has to be that these people were harmed, right, wronged, when the things happened that happened. Right? And so you might think then, well, how are they wronged? Well, the oil belonged to them, and it was taken from them without full compensation, or without paying them, or without asking them even if they wanted to sell it. Right? Is that kind of, am I still on the right track? Right. So that fits very well with what the Alaskan government is doing, would seem fairly correctly, right? At least in this view, that the oil in Alaska belongs to the Alaskan people, and so when they sell it on behalf of the Alaskan people, they paid back to the Alaskans, right? And so that's what ought to have happened in Venezuela and didn't happen, and that's the wrong that we're trying to... Are we so far on the same track? Okay. Right. So if we assume for a moment that thing, so maybe for Venezuela or countries like it, many other countries where wrongful expropriation of resources has happened, you can make an argument for opening the borders. But you'd have to accept then at least the following, right? Like, let's say that with other countries, let's say Norway. Norway sits also on a big pile of oil, but it's not nearly as, nothing is going on like these other countries. Norwegian people might want to immigrate to the United States, right? But then if we accept the same intuition that the Americans own the American resources, and maybe we want to say then the Americans own the American land because that's the stuff that contains the resources, then you might say to the Norwegians, well, we didn't violate you guys in the past, and this is ours, so you have to stay out. So Karens wouldn't like that, so of course Karens is going to. I mean, there's no obvious answer here, right? Because if you don't do that, if you want to say, like Karens, hey, the American people don't own the land. Well, do they own the resources in the land? Why do we say, if you want to say yes, now you have to have an explanation for why the resources but not the land. Right? Now let's say we say no, right? Okay, well then no wrong was happening in Venezuela. That doesn't seem the right answer either. Right? So it's going to be complicated in both directions, it seems. Anyway. Reggie, you had your hand up a second ago. You do that too often, man. You have an idea and then you pull it up. All right.
I was going to say that.
Good. I like it.
In her point, if they were taking the oil from Venezuela and they're not getting back as far as monetary or anything
Yeah.
what they receive. Now, if they were getting that back, they wouldn't want to leave and come to America because their country would be rich and fruitful and everything else. So if you're exporting all your natural resources, say like in Africa, how they export so many diamonds, minerals, everything else. So many countries, U.S., Britain, everybody. If they were able to keep most of their resources, then it would create a better country and you wouldn't have so much fighting and stuff like that. So would it work in that aspect?
Yeah, that's like, I mean, that I think is Pogge's point, right? So when we read Pogge, he thinks the fact that we live in a world in which countries like the ones we live in keep buying what really are like stolen goods, stolen from the people in this case, right? So assuming, again, something like the second premise here, not governments but people. The fact that we keep doing that, right, is contributing to these countries being so poor and badly run, right? And so to that effect, we are causing the misery there. So, and he would say, for sure, like if you solve that, and you solve the misery there, then a lot of other problems are going to disappear too, right? So like the fact that most people don't want to leave home if they don't have to. Right? It's because life where they live is much worse than life where they want to go. And so if you make life where they live better, then presumably more of them are going to stay. Yeah. Right?
So say you grant that all these arguments were, that these fall apart, because I think premise 2 on, A is complete bull. Government, I think it's just a big bully. Not like frequently, I think some things it is good. But anyway, say you grant all this and you say, yes, it is better to allow all immigrants and all this. I think in a utopian world it is better. I don't think those arguments succeed, even if you say it's better to do that it is better to adopt a everyone come in policy. For example, I think we can all agree, for those who have paid any attention to it, that the Assad regime has done terrible things. That it would be better for the Assad regime to not be in charge than be in charge. But the fact of the matter is, even though they've done horrible things and it's better for them not to be in charge, if you take them out and ISIS the reality is you're going to create a vacuum and ISIS comes in. We see that happen elsewhere. And it's like, so even though, yes, that argument is successful, you can show it would be better to have the Assad regime in, not than the Assad regime in. Your argument is successful there. I don't think really anyone except for the Assad regime in Russia and a few other countries.
So quite a few,
They're horrible countries.
Yeah.
They're horrible ideas. Anyway, anyone who's acting morally would
Sure.
agree with that. But like I'm saying, even though that argument works, it does not follow that the right course of action is to allow immigrants in. Does that make sense?
Is your point that just saying one thing is bad doesn't mean that the reasonable alternative is better?
We say X is bad.
Yeah.
So you should do this to stop X. Well, I'm saying, so sure, that argument is successful, that it would be better without X. But I'm saying X is just going to be replaced by something else. X is just going to be replaced by Y, which is worse than what X is. And so what you really want is, even though it's better to not have X, you want whatever variable there is the least problematic. So it's still obviously not optimal. It's not the best. But it's a necessary evil because it could be worse.
Right, good. Well, that'll do very little, of course, for someone like Karen's, right? Like, if we say, not for Karen's, for the one person the opponent of Karen's, the person who wants to keep the borders closed. We say, well, treating governments or the people as the owner of the territory is a necessary evil. It's the best of the situations that we have available. well, okay, but now we have other, because now here I am, right, a migrant who's about to die. Syria, they're fighting. I want to come into you, Germany. The Germans say, well, yeah, we know we don't really own this place, but we're going to treat it as if we own it because, well, whatever other system is going to be worse. I say, well, not going to be worse for me.
In your example, though, there's not a risk of just letting, you know, well, I guess some people might disagree because of the terrorism, but I don't know. That's why that one's an iffy situation. But I don't think letting, as you just said, your example, letting an immigrant in, that doesn't affect the argument because you're not risking, at that point, X being replaced by something worse by letting that person in. Does that make sense?
Well, if it's not, then I'm not sure. Okay, well, then fine. Then it doesn't work.
So I'm saying, complete open borders.
I mean, the idea is, of course, like large-scale immigration consists of one immigrant at a time, right? So each individual is showing up and saying, how about me? Do I get to come in? No, because what? Well, because the alternative is worse. Well, the alternative is me dying, right? So that presumably to keep someone out for whom the stakes are very, very high, you better have a good argument, just a fundamental good argument. And if the argument is, it's really crappy, but I can't think of anything better, or it's really crappy, but I'm afraid of what else might happen, well, then you have to show why the bad effects that are looming for you outweigh the bad effects that are looming for the other side.
I think you
right?
could.
And then,
are you familiar with the Laffer curve with taxes?
Sure.
I think you can make a case for something similar with immigration, where it's one person is no risk. Wait, I guess that wouldn't be because if you had all people, that's a maximum risk. Never mind. But I was thinking of something else. Okay. Because at some point it does become a risk. It's just at what point is that? So that's why I don't think that works. It's not all or nothing.
To go back to the point, to get to the point earlier, if we're talking about the point that Reggie was bringing up, so Reggie said, look, we're talking about a world in which governments treat resources as if they're free to extract and sell as if they're theirs, and they aren't because they're the people's.
It's their land. It's
Right.
their property.
Right.
Like somebody from China could come over to America without permits, laws, and everything else, and just start drilling for oil. So it is their land. It is the government's land. I mean, however you want to put it. You can't go to Brazil and just set up a corporation and just start taking out all their resources. So it is the government's land. I mean, I know how you try to put it, but it's not.
We're not.
So the idea would have been then that it might have. The idea would have been that maybe the alternative to that system that we have, like that's the system that we have, right? That's the system also that that Poggi objects to, right? Because he thinks when we put whatever is the government in charge of this, you're incentivizing being in power, right? Because there's a lot of money in oil. So, and when you incentivize people just being in power, you're not incentivizing good behavior, you're not incentivizing justice, human rights, you're incentivizing power, and power is a bad thing to incentivize. Right? So, if the claim is, well, maybe, but that's just one part of the story. Maybe the alternative is even worse. Right? That's good, fair enough, right? So anyone who come up with an argument against the system should propose something that they might think it will work better, and that's not an obvious thing. But yeah, if we could come up with something better, I think your point is well taken. You'd probably see pressures on migration reduce a lot. You see populations. Yeah. Brazil's nicer, probably, if it functioned well, then.
But that'll never happen.
Yeah. Well, let's hope. Let's not end the term on that pessimistic note, but I hope it will fit. Maybe. Claudia, yeah.
So he's against the number two, so the government owns territory as property. Personally, I also don't think they own it, but because like in a democratic society, we voted for a government and we voted for them to not own the property for us, but to take care of the property for us as people. So they have the right to, as long as they're the government, as long as we voted them in, they have the right to do with the property what, like we gave them that right. And so we take it away again by voting for a different thing. So if you had that, if you don't say they own it, but they own the right to, like take care of it and to like just manage, exactly, to manage it, as long as they're like in in the government, they're the party that voted for, then the whole, like, his objection wouldn't work anymore.
Good, good. Yeah, so you hear, maybe let me restate your idea and see if I get it, right? So you might think of a property right is not a simple thing, right? It's a really complex thing. It's just the way that lawyers often talk about it is like, think about it as a bundle of sticks. And each stick in the bundle represents a different thing you can do with your property right. So one stick is you can exclude people, another stick is you can sell it, yet another stick is you can rent it out, and then you can do things on it, and so like all these sticks together, that's your property right. And so when we vote for the government, we keep the bundle, but we take out one stick, which is the decision to let in foreigners or not, right? And we hand that over to the government, right? And then say, you manage our property, all of us together, right? With regard to this one stick. Or probably more sticks, but in this context, just that one stick. Right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, but like, not only like who you can let in, but also what they can do with the territories. Like as long as like, I mean, obviously if it belongs to like specific people who have the contract, maybe it's part of the land's mine because I thought it, but like in general, like.
Right. So they would still have that big part of this bundle.
Decide if, I don't know, if there's a forest and like they need to build a school, they can decide to do that with it, like, things like that.
Right.
As well.
Yeah. So the government comes in and says you need to paint your walls blue, right? And I say, no, I don't. So, well, you voted for us. Well, when I voted, I kept a whole bunch of sticks in my bundle, including the stick that says I get to decide which color my walls go, right? But then there's other sticks, like who gets to come in, or maybe the people who come in, certain things they can and cannot do on the land, and so on, right? So that's the idea? Right. Yeah, so John Simmons is a philosopher who works at the University of Virginia. He's a really good Locke theorist, the best Locke theorist, I think. And he thinks that Locke's theory of the government by consent works like that. And so you can justify closing the borders on that because all the people together will own the property that makes up the territory, and they will all take one of these sticks out of each of their bundles and then together give that to the government. And so now the government has the right to make that decision over the entire territory. Again, a couple of assumptions. It's going to be a little tricky to see if we can have the exact right stick be pulled out. So the stick that says yes to foreigners but not to anyone else, right? So can you qualify the right that way? Maybe yes. Maybe you can do that. Because presumably the government doesn't have the right to tell me who of my family I get to come have over and stay at my house. You know? So that's one. The other is territories don't always consist of pieces of land, all of which have been owned by the individuals. Right? So there might be certain parts that have become public, like national parks, were never owned by individuals. The government just claimed them. Well, now they really own them, but there might be other parts too that in the territory that are just unowned. Pieces of water, for example, a lot of pieces of water. So, but they still exclude from there. Could they? The air is like another one. That usually the air is not owned. At least if you go high up. Up to a certain altitude. So it's about. That's not international. That's actually domestic law, but whatever. So airlines can fly over your property without trespassing as long as they go high enough. There was a case like that in Transatlantic Air in the 1930s was sued for trespass. It's very similar to the railroad problem, right? Like if you have to pay everyone who you fly over, you're never going to have any air traffic going. And then the most problematic one, of course, is going to be that, well, does everybody who owns property in a territory, by voting, freely hand over part of their property rights? Right? You would not accept a sale on under any type of condition like that, right? If I come into your home and I say, there's me and there's the other candidate, right? You can choose between us two, but one of us is going to own part of your home. Sign on the dotted line. That's clear fraud, right? I'd violate your property right if I do that. But that's exactly what the government does when they have an election, right? They come in, they say, Trump, Clinton, or some other ones, but let's focus on those. Trump or Clinton, and one of these two is going to be in charge and going to make decisions about who gets to come into the territory and the other one doesn't. But one of them will, right? It's not going to be you. So is voting for one of these under those conditions the same as freely handing over part of your property right? But anyway. those are the standard objections. Simmons thinks you can get around them, at least in principle. Probably not in practice, he thinks, but at least in principle. So it is a good idea. Tamir, did you have your hand up? Oh no, Reggie. Sorry, I knew it was in the back.
Because I understand what he's saying, what Karen's saying. But I guess I'm looking at it like realistically. If they wanted to, say the government or say your local politicians or city, if they wanted to move you out of your property and it's your property you pay for it, they could just raise your property tax up. They would make it where you couldn't afford it, so you would have to move. You know, like sort of squeeze you, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
They can squeeze you. The government and politicians, they can squeeze you in any kind of way where it's not really your property. You paid for it, you think it's yours, but it's not really yours. I'd rather say you're renting.
And that's why governments for the most part terrible.
Good. Well, so Locke would agree with this, right? So if a government can sort of unilaterally, without asking your permission, just keep ramping up the taxes so as to squeeze you out.
Or rezone you.
Yeah, right. And it doesn't have to be intentional, right? There's stories about this in certain areas in California, for example. They were like Southern California that were in the 60s fairly affordable and have become unbelievably expensive since then. I mean, the property tax gets done on the city estimates what your property is worth, and then they just hit a percentage of that. So if you were working class, bought a property in one of these areas, at some point, the percentage of the value is going to, I mean, it's not a tragedy, right? These people are sitting on an enormous cloud of wealth. They bought it for 60 grand and it's worth 600,000 or something, right? So, but still, it's, to being forced to move is pretty crappy, right? So that can happen, yeah, for sure. Locke would say you don't really own it. Some philosophers, typically those who are more liberal in the policy, liberal like left-wing liberal, they also agree with you that you don't really own it. But where Locke thinks this is a bad thing, they think it's a good thing. So they think it should be just generally up to the government or the population how to run these things. They think it's fine. Justice should be that. Like justice requires that you're just a renter. You don't really own anything. But it's a tricky one. Either way, right? So we'll finish on this. When Cairns wants to go say, like, look, territory really isn't like property, and so you can't justify keeping out immigrants on that basis. In some sense, that seems obviously right. I own my house, right? That seems the intuitively right thing to say, but it's a little more complicated. What Claudia said, you might say, well, you might be in ownership in a whole bunch of respects, but not in this one respect. Given that away. Then again, maybe I'm not even an owner in all those other respects, right? For the reasons that you're pointing out. Well, they can tax it. They can tax you out of the area. Maybe they can just take it from you, like Tamir showed. And then there's the question of natural resources, right? If you think it's true that the people of a country own their resources, like the oil or the diamonds or whatever, then it becomes very tempting to also think they own their territory. Tough to see why they might own the things that are contained in the territory if they don't own the territory. So there's maybe a hefty price to pay for this. But either way, right? Like if you go the other way, if you think, no, the people really do own the resources. You think, well, if they own the resources, they probably own the ultimate resource, which is the land itself. Then this argument becomes sound, right? Then you have to give up on open borders if that's what you like in the first instance. Yeah, Mike. Well, it's I guess the charge question. Yeah, go on.
But I feel like if I belong to a government and become a country, there's a mutual relationship, almost in the same way property and territory do.
Mm-hmm.
That property doesn't have a right in the same sense that I do.
Right. So there's different ways you can belong, right? So I belong to a certain family. Doesn't mean my parents own me, right? The way they own a car, right?
They would disagree as long as you're not an adult. Like, my parents would always be like, as long as you're not 18, we own what you do, basically. Like, both in the positive and negative way.
Right. Yeah. So I own a cat, right? So maybe that's like a property thing. Like the cat is actual property that I can sell the cat, right?
Aren't you responsible? I mean, that was a great point because if your child is under 18 years old, the parent is responsible for whatever that child does, because the law come back to that parent.
Yeah, I mean, it all depends what you're going to hang on saying yes, they're your property, right? Like if you just say, we're going to call it property, but you cannot do a whole bunch of stuff to the people that you can do to other things we call property, then the word itself doesn't matter so much, right? It's going to matter like what does it mean to answer this by yes. I mean, if it means people cannot leave the country, then it starts looking like a kind of controlling type of ownership that even Miller, who's not a fan of open borders, right? Like even Miller thinks that's too much. He won't accept that you can't leave.
But our government pretty much retains that, right? All they have to do is put you on a no-fly list, and you can be put on those for anything. There are 5- and 6-year-old little girls that are on the no-fly list just because their name sounds suspicious.
Yeah, they cannot take away your right to leave the country without violating your human rights. So if they do that, I mean, they can prevent certain types of transport. But if you take your car and you go to the Mexican border and Mexico will let you in, then there you go. You get on a boat and they can't stop you from actually leaving, unless there is a warrant out or something, right? Like if you're a criminal, wanted criminal, they can do that. But then after you serve your sentence, you still get to go. So that's a fundamental human right, at least in standard law. So if they did that, and you could take the government to court, and you would win. Hopefully they respect it, right?
Yeah.
But you would win, yeah. So, I mean, one of the contexts in which it does play is the brain drain stuff. So we've talked a couple times last week about brain drain. So some people worry about worldwide migration, that the talented people from poor countries leave. And they say, well, poor countries can keep the talented people in. Some countries have tried to do this. Pakistan has famously done it in the 80s. But, so there are defenders of that idea. One of the strong objections, I think, to that is that it is akin to treating people as property, and they aren't. That's the start. That's the objection that's raised. All right, Jeff. You have the last word of term. How about that?
All right.
Make it good.
I hope it's good. So canceling your passport, flagging your passport, that's a way of restricting you to the country. So how is that not a problem?
Well, yeah, these things are controversial for that very reason, right? So like if they make it such that anytime you try to cross the border, you're going to be stopped, they have to have cause for that, and that cause has to be like legally. You should, right? Or you're like you suspected of terrorist activities or something.
But just from your name, that's not.
Well, so the idea is, I mean, the idea, if not always the practice, right? But the idea is that if they do this, they have to have some type of evidence. You can challenge this in court. They have to produce the evidence, and an impartial judge will decide whether they're right or wrong. And if they're wrong, you can go, like is your human right. And if they're right, and you're actually up to no good, well, then you're up to no good. And then of course, over the last sort of 16 years, that process has eroded pretty significantly. So. Yeah, well, so two Bush and two Obama administrations have chipped away at this pretty thoroughly. So, and that's something that a lot of people worry about. Whatever. All right. Any last questions? There's 1 more minute. Someone can have the last word. All right. Well, I'll catch us up on Miller. I'm glad that we could end the term in missing one more reading. That seems very fitting. If one thing you want to remember from this class, that'll be it. Well, thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.